Two churches are bombed in Egypt, packed with Coptic worshippers, a religious minority that's feeling increasingly targeted. So what's the government doing to protect them? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Two attacks, again targeting churches in Egypt, killing dozens of people. This time on one of the holiest days in the Christian calendar. The first blast was at the Coptic church of St George in Tanta, a city north of Cairo. A suicide bomber then struck outside the main Coptic church in Alexandria, St Mark's Cathedral, where Pope Tawadros II had led the Mass. The bombings come just a few weeks before Pope Francis is due to visit Egypt. We'll talk to our guests in just a moment, but first this report from Ahmed.
The first attack happened inside the Mar Gerges church, also known as St George's. The church is in the Nile Delta city of Tanta, north of the capital Cairo. It was packed, the faithful there to mark the holy day of Palm Sunday. The power of the blast clear in what was left behind.
My son, he is still in the operation theater. I was on the altar while my son was standing among the deacons. All of a sudden, the bomb exploded. Lots of bodies were torn apart, scattered on the floor. This act doesn't please God.
I suddenly saw flames flaring up to the church ceiling. There was thick smoke. I couldn't see anyone. We heard voices telling us to leave quickly. People were pushing so much the gate bent.
Hours later in the coastal city of Alexandria, a second blast targeted a church. The head of the Coptic church in Alexandria, Pope Tawadros II, had left the church shortly before a suicide bomber detonated his explosives outside. Churches have been targeted in the past. The most recent was in December at Cairo's largest Coptic cathedral. ISIL claimed responsibility for that attack. Pope Francis, speaking at the Vatican, condemned these attacks. He's due to visit Egypt later this month to build on a growing partnership between Muslims and Christians to combat religious violence. These pictures were filmed in the immediate aftermath of the blast in Tanta. Churchgoers, now mourners, unable to comprehend how this place of worship could now be the scene of such violence. Ahmed, Al Jazeera.
Well, these aren't the first attacks on Christians in Egypt. In December last year, Cairo's largest Coptic cathedral was bombed and at least 25 people were killed. In 2013, a particularly high number of churches and Christian institutions were torched and looted, prompting human rights groups to demand Egyptian authorities take more action. And the violence against Egypt's Christian minority dates back before the unrest that followed the revolution in 2011. Shortly before President Hosni Mubarak was ousted, 21 people died in a suspected suicide bombing at a church in Alexandria. Well, let's now get the thoughts of our guests. Joining us from Cairo, Timothy Kaldas, a non-resident fellow at Tahrir Institute for Middle East Politics. From Berlin, Ahmed Badawi, senior researcher at the Centre for Middle Eastern and North African Politics at the Free University of Berlin. And from London, Omar Ashour, senior lecturer in Middle East Politics and Security Studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. Great to have you all with us. Welcome to Inside Story. Timothy, two very targeted attacks that we've seen today on a hugely symbolic day in the Christian calendar. They were really designed, weren't they, for maximum impact?
Absolutely. The decision to strike on Palm Sunday, the beginning of Holy Week in the lead up to Easter, is definitely a strategic decision to maximize casualties as church attendance surges during this week, particularly on a day like today. And the result is that we have a body count that has surpassed 40 and is climbing. And even the church that the Pope was leading Mass in was targeted today.
Ahmed, what do you make of the style of these attacks? We saw one explosive device planted inside the church, and we saw the other one in Alexandria. We think that it's outside the church. What do you read into that?
Well, it seems that there are similarities between this attack and the attack that took place in December. Somehow somebody managed to get into the church, either using himself as a bomb, as happened in December, or planting a bomb, as far as we know now, planting a bomb under a seat in the church. Of course, the glaring similarity is where was the security forces, especially in this attack. They should have had some forewarning from the attack in December, and I would have expected that they would have increased the security around at least the bigger churches in the Delta, in Cairo and in Upper Egypt. But apparently something didn't work right. Otherwise, how could somebody walk into the church with something that could easily contain a bomb, put this bomb under a seat, leave, and then the bomb later explodes? So that's another similarity. A third similarity, it seems that we've seen offshoots from the Muslim Brothers who have taken to violence, but they usually target security forces and state officials. But it seems that this attack and the one that happened in December, it's probably from further afield. It could be that it's done by the Islamic State, the Sinai province. And if this turns out to be the case, then that's another big question mark. How could the government allow this to happen after all that what they have been doing in Sinai in order to combat the Islamic State? So these are three main points that I would focus on in the next few hours and days.
Okay, and we'll certainly return to the ISIL claim of responsibility that we have seen so far. Just before I get to that, I want to stick with the security question. Omar, do we know what precautions were taken, especially in this very holy week of the Christian calendar?
We have some idea. Usually what happens is an increase of security personnel and increased around the church and sometimes inside the church, and some enhanced intelligence report on what do potential terrorist organizations are trying to do. But obviously there was in this case an intelligence failure, although IS made it very clearly in February of that year that it is going to sustain the attacks on the Christian community, or Orthodox Christian community particularly, and they named figures that they wanted to target, and they took response, and they claimed that the December attack was one of them who did it. And also they found apparently in the Alexandria church, it seems that they earlier found a planted bomb there a few weeks before today's attack. So there were too many indicators. So I think there was on one end an intelligence failure, and on the other end, apparently in the Alexandria attack there was limited damage because the alleged suicide bomber failed to enter the church, and most of the damage killed I think a petty officer and two other officers around it. So most of the damage happened outside of it. So the mushrooming of the security personnel apparently limited the damage in that sense. But of course this is just on tactical level, on the micro scale if you wish. On the meso and on the macro level, there is of course a serious problem in Egypt, problem of political violence that has been escalating quite significantly since July 2013, and there is a failure to deal with it.
Okay, yeah, Timothy, do you see this as a massive security failure on behalf of the authorities?
I think that we have to separate the two different attacks because the circumstances surrounding them and how the security apparatus dealt with them is a bit different. With respect to the bombing in Tanta, which I think perhaps Professor Ashour confused for the situation in Alexandria, there was a bomb found in Tanta a week ago on March 29th, and it was found and dismantled by security apparatus. Here we have a situation where the security apparatus knew that the church was being targeted. They knew that a very important holiday was coming, and the question is what exceptional measures were taken to try to avert what took place this morning. And it seems that already the state has determined that not enough was done, hence the firing of the director of security for Harbeya, which is the province in which Tanta exists. With respect to Alexandria, the situation, I think, needs to be weighed a little bit differently and judged a little bit differently. the attackers attempted to enter the church and were stopped by security. That's why the device was detonated outside of the church. So there was an attempt by the security apparatus to block their entry from the church, and that did minimize the casualties and prevent an attack on the Coptic Pope himself. I think with Tanta, you have a clear situation where you have information, you have intelligence, and there's inadequate use of that information. And that's something that needs to be scrutinized very carefully, and people need to be held accountable for those failures. With respect to what happened in Alexandria, I think we have a situation where it's not so clear that there was a failure so much as, unfortunately, in the world we live in, terrorists do launch these sorts of attacks on soft targets and do try to hit areas with large populations, whether they be regular civilians or they have a sectarian incentive or drive, as is the case here in Egypt today. And there is a limit to what you can do to protect thousands of churches. More needs to be done, but at the same time, we have to have a realistic understanding of what is physically possible.
Okay, Ahmed, you touched on it before. ISIL, the threat of ISIL, and this comes mainly from a group in the Sinai Peninsula, which we know is very active down there. The military is pursuing that group in the area. We've had this video in February specifically saying that it will increase attacks against Copts in Egypt. Have we seen a reciprocal upsurge in military offensives against this ISIL group in Sinai in response to that?
Well, the information that is coming out of Sinai is very sketchy. There is some kind of a blackout. Journalists are not allowed to go there. There's no independent sources that would verify what is exactly happening in the Sinai. There are reports that in Sisi's recent visit to the US, the Trump administration expressed displeasure with the way he's been handling the security problem in Sinai. So far, what we know, it seems that the government or the security or the military is handling the situation in Sinai in very traditional military means, whereas many people are of the opinion that it should be more of an intelligence effort, and definitely something that needs to be done to deal with the economic and social conditions in Sinai, to increase the levels of development there in order to try to prevent more recruits driven by anger at their situation to join the ranks of the radical Islamists. And also what is happening in Sinai on its own is one thing, but then allowing that to spill over to mainland Egypt is another. Of course, I agree with Timothy, it's impossible to provide 100% protection against terrorist attacks, but churches are not exactly soft targets anymore, especially after the announcement that was made in February. So there should have been an expectation that all churches are now potential targets, especially for those Islamists that are either coming from Sinai, who are members of the Islamic State, or who are somehow affiliated to them or identify with them, even though they maybe have never been to the Sinai. So churches needs extra protection now. And of course, this is a big dilemma for the government. And thinking that this problem of terrorism would only be solved by security measures alone, that's another thing that we need to reconsider and think about very carefully. I doubt that this is possible. And of course, I so far haven't seen any real inclination, any steps on behalf of the government to deal with the level of polarization that exists in society, and which I think is the main source for the political violence that we see in Egypt now.
Omar, would you agree with that? We'll look more widely at Egypt in just a moment, but I'm thinking particularly in Sinai Peninsula, where hundreds of Christians were actually forced to flee in February. The army, it appeared, could not protect them in their homes, and they were told to leave and go elsewhere. Is that dealing with the problem?
No, it's not. There are two problems here. But first, very quickly on where the bombing happened. The second bombing, according to the Yom al-Saba, was in Alexandria, actually, a few weeks ago. And before it, there was one after it in September 2015, also planted in another church. So there was a systematic targeting in Alexandria, not necessarily in Tanta. In Tanta, the issue with General Hussam Khalifa was basically he came after the bombing and denied that there is a bombing, and said that it was a negative report. You know, there was no bomb, basically. So I think that added more problems to his issue. As for the strategy, the pillars of the combating the insurgency in Sinai are quite contradictory. You know, they are doing three things. They're basically a very intensive repression campaign, but more or less want to kill as much insurgents as possible, but also to kind of terrorize the population and to make them very fearful of assisting the insurgency in any way. And this is you can see this by the F-16 bombing specific villages, heavy bombardment in towns, residential areas. So more or less very wide net military bordering on scorched earth tactics in that way. But also on the other end, you have the propaganda, which is it is designed to counter the propaganda of the insurgents, but it's not very credible propaganda. You know, like declaring people who are dead, who turned out in the videos of IS to be not dead, and mocking the regime, or declaring if you collaborate with us, you get benefits, and when you collaborate, you actually go to jail. So not very credible propaganda. And then the intelligence part, which my colleague referred to, which is quite critical, but because of the level of repression, and two, the propaganda and the statements are not very credible, you have less and less likely locals to collaborate. The insurgents, on the other hand, are quite capitalize on these three failures. The repression part, they issue this narrative that helps them to recruit. On the informants part, they consistently assassinate any potential informants. There have been, in the second year of operation, there has been about 78 assassination. First year, over 146 operations, basically killing any potential suspects that informs or collaborate with the regime.
Okay, so there's a lot of problems with the way the military is dealing with the insurgency in the Sinai Peninsula. Let's just bring the discussion back a little bit to Cairo, to Egypt more broadly, because Timothy, we've seen the Copts support Sisi's government, whether it's perceived or real. It's there, and it's there in Egypt, and especially in light of the overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood leader Mohammed Morsi. Why then are we not seeing Sisi better protect them? Do the Coptic community feel let down?
I think well, first, just to parse what you open with. There's quite a lot of Copts who do take issue with the government. The official position of the church notwithstanding, amongst the population, there's a lot of people who are very frustrated with how things have gone with respect to the church building law, with respect to rebuilding churches that were destroyed following the overthrow of Morsi, etc. Moreover, I mean, while the official position of the church has been to support the overthrow of Morsi, that was also the case with Ashour, which officially represents the Muslim community in Egypt. To what extent it does so successfully is a separate question. But yes, absolutely. There is definitely frustration amongst the population. That's why you saw scenes outside of the church in Tanta where the director of security for Tarbeya was being beaten by congregants after he visited the church. There's huge frustration with the failure of the state to secure these places. In December, you saw a bunch of pro-government media personalities try to visit the scene of the bombing and get shooed and beaten and pushed out of the scene quite forcefully, and they basically fled for their lives. So undoubtedly, there's very serious anger and frustration amongst many over these issues and over these failures.
Ahmed, it's been suggested, and I put this to you, that these sorts of attacks against the Copts play into Sisi's narrative as the fighter of terrorism in Egypt, and thereby support his crackdown, as many would say it, his repressive regime. Do you buy into that?
There could be an element of that, of course. After such attacks, the government can always portray itself that it is very much engaged in the fight against terrorism. It justifies crackdowns on liberties and all that. But that's a very short-term gain, if that is indeed seen by the government as a gain. Because on the other hand, these attacks, as we've just heard, they destroy one of the core components of the coalition that is supporting the current regime, namely the Coptic Christians and the Coptic Church. Second, they don't do any, they're not helpful at all in terms of bringing tourism back. And we know that tourism was just beginning to pick up. An attack at this time is damaging to the prospect of bringing tourists back. And of course, if Egypt wants to get out of the economic crisis that it is currently facing, there is no conceivable way that it could do that without the foreign currency that comes from tourism. So on the whole, yes, there might be on the discursive level some gains for the government from such attacks, but in terms of cost-benefit analysis of what is the overall value of such attacks for the government, I think they do more harm than good, and I think they do more damage to the reputation of the government and the perceived image of Sisi and his government as the protecting stability in Egypt. Of course, such attacks definitely hit at this image, and they threaten the kind of stability that the regime is claiming to be safeguarding in Egypt.
Okay. And Timothy, you touched on this earlier. Let's not forget that there are a number of small-scale attacks that go on frequently against the Copt community by their Muslim neighbourhoods, especially in poorer, more rural areas like Mina, I'm thinking of. And these tend to average sort of one a month. Why is there this sort of ingrained discrimination in this area?
Well, I mean, there have been sectarian tensions in Egypt for a long time, long before the overthrow of Morsi, long before the uprising in 2011. And I mean, it's been an ongoing source of frustration for the Coptic community in the way the government deals with these incidents of either sectarian clashes or sometimes rioting involving attacks on churches and Christian homes and Christian businesses. Often the government, rather than prosecute the perpetrators, they'll call for a traditional gathering in which they just try to negotiate with the elders of the community a solution. And that solution often requires the Christians to somehow accept either leaving, being forced out of where they live, or some sort of nominal monetary compensation rather than legal justice in terms of an actual prosecution, conviction, people going to prison for committing crimes. And it undermines the integrity of the state's claim to be a defender of law and order. It undermines its claims that it supports equal citizenship and equal protection under law. And this is an ongoing problem. And I think it also, I mean, at the end of the day, fundamentally, the state doesn't treat Christians equally. And so they create a context in which people can see them as second-class citizens and lesser Egyptians.
Okay. Omar, we're running out of time. I am keen to look forward a little bit, so I'm going to ask you about the future. We've got Easter at the end of the week. We've got Pope Francis's visit to Egypt at the end of the month. Can we expect to see security stepped up? Can we expect to see more attacks?
Security stepped up, yes, definitely, because this is usually the most common reaction of the security services once an attack happens. They step up the security and cast a white net of arrest when this happens. More attacks, yes, as well. I think IS made it very clear in their video that this is a policy that they're going to pursue. More terrorist attacks, specifically targeting the Christian Coptic Orthodox minority. Some of these attacks are easy targets, so attacking a church in a remote area is kind of an easy target. So we can expect both. The problem, though, is that there is no very clear, on the macro level, on the mid to long-term level, there is no clear strategy to deal with, one, the insurgency in Sinai, two, the problem of political violence and terrorism in the valley in Cairo, and three, behind the elephant in the room that no one wants to talk to, the problem of sectarianism in Egypt, which has been a problem, as Timothy mentioned, since probably the 50s. First with the Jewish community, and then also with the Baha'i community, and then with the wider Christian communities of all sorts. There is this sense of sectarian polarization that is going on in the country. It was made worse after July 2013, specifically because of the warring sides, the warring political sides. But there is no counter strategy to undermine it and to build a better non-sectarian national identity of some sort.
Okay,
or
Omar, we do have to leave it there. I'm afraid we have run out of time for our discussion today. Many thanks to you, Omar Ashour, also Timothy Kaldas and Ahmed Badawi for joining us on Today Inside Story. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.